In 1989, Pepsi, yes, the soda company, the one that lost the Cola Wars so hard they had to hire Michael Jackson, briefly owned the sixth largest navy on planet Earth. 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, a destroyer, all owned by a company whose primary business was carbonated sugar water. For one glorious moment in history, if Pepsi had felt spicy enough, they could have declared war on a small country. And won. How did a soft drink brand end up with more military hardware than most NATO members? Buckle up, because this story involves Cold War politics, a screaming match in a model kitchen, and the Soviet Union paying its bar tab with warships. Let's rewind to 1959. The Cold War is in full swing. America and the Soviet Union are locked in a decades-long staring contest where both sides have enough nukes to end civilization several times over, but instead of fighting, they mostly just showed off at each other. Like two guys at the gym who hate each other but legally can't throw hands. One of these flexing competitions was the American National Exhibition in Moscow, basically a giant trade show where the US set up shop in the middle of the Soviet Union and said, "Look at our stuff. Look at our washing machines. Look at our color TVs. Doesn't capitalism seem fun?" And it was at this exhibition that one of the most famous arguments in history took place. The kitchen debate. Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev stood in a model American kitchen and argued heatedly on camera about whose economic system was better. Two of the most powerful men on earth, bickering next to a dishwasher like a married couple at IKEA. Now here's where our hero enters. A Pepsi executive named Donald Kendall was at that exhibition, and Kendall had a problem. His bosses back home thought sending Pepsi to Moscow was a waste of money. Communists drinking Pepsi? Ridiculous. So Kendall, staring down the barrel of a career-ending flop, did what any rational businessman would do. He decided to use the Vice President of the United States as a marketing prop. The night before the debate, Kendall met with Nixon and basically said, "Hey Dick, do me a solid, get Khrushchev in front of my Pepsi booth. I need this." And Nixon incredibly said yes. So the next day, mid-argument, Nixon steers the leader of the Soviet Union, a man in charge of thousands of nuclear weapons, directly to the Pepsi stand. And Khrushchev, hot, sweaty, and cranky from yelling about kitchens, takes a cup of Pepsi and downs it. Then another. Then another. Reports say he drank several cups while photographers snapped away like it was a red carpet. The photo of Khrushchev chugging Pepsi went global. The unofficial slogan practically wrote itself. Khrushchev learns to be sociable. Pepsi had just pulled off the greatest product placement in human history, and the product placer was the future president of the United States. But here's the catastrophe part. Getting Khrushchev to drink Pepsi was easy. Getting the Soviet Union to buy Pepsi? That took another 13 years of negotiating, because it turns out selling soda to your sworn ideological enemy involves a little paperwork. Fast forward to 1972. Kendall is now the CEO of Pepsi, because of course he is. The Khrushchev stunt basically made his career. And he finally lands the deal of the century. Pepsi becomes the first Western consumer product officially sold in the Soviet Union. Coca-Cola executives reportedly wept into their glass bottles. Probably. There was just one teeny tiny hilarious problem. Soviet money was worthless. The ruble wasn't traded internationally. You couldn't take rubles out of the USSR and exchange them, because outside the Soviet Union, rubles had roughly the same purchasing power as monopoly money. Actually, that's unfair to monopoly money. At least monopoly money is recognized in every American household. So Pepsi says, "Okay, you can't pay us in cash. What do you have?" And the Soviets look around and go, "Vodka?" And this is how one of the weirdest trade deals ever was born. Pepsi ships soda syrup to the USSR, and in exchange, Pepsi gets the exclusive rights to sell Stolichnaya vodka in the United States. Soda for vodka, a barter system between a Fortune 500 company and a nuclear superpower. Two of the most advanced economies on the planet, trading like medieval farmers swapping a goat for some turnips. And amazingly, it worked for years. Soviets guzzled Pepsi by the millions. By the late 80s, Soviets were drinking about 1 billion servings a year. Pepsi was so popular behind the Iron Curtain that it became a symbol of Western luxury. The vodka flowed one way, the syrup flowed the other, and everyone was happy. Until they weren't. By 1989, the deal needed renewing, and there were problems. Pepsi wanted to expand. More bottling plants, more soda, more money. But Soviet demand for Pepsi had grown way beyond what vodka sales could cover. And to make things worse, Americans were boycotting Soviet products over the war in Afghanistan, which meant Stolichnaya sales were tanking. The vodka pipeline couldn't pay the soda bill anymore, so the Soviets once again look around the house to see what they can pawn. Rubles? Still worthless. Vodka? Not enough. And then someone in the Kremlin has the single greatest, oh, what about this? Moment in economic history. What about the Navy? I need you to understand this actually happened. In the spring of 1989, the Soviet Union signed a deal transferring 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer to PepsiCo, plus new oil tankers, in exchange for soda syrup. The submarines went for about $150,000 each. That's less than a house. In New Jersey, they were old, rusted, and destined for scrap, sure. But on paper, for a brief shining moment, Pepsi possessed a naval fleet larger than that of most countries on Earth. The sixth largest navy in the world, depending on how you counted, owned by the company that makes Mountain Dew. And Donald Kendall, the man who started all this by ambushing Khrushchev with a paper cup 30 years earlier, reportedly delivered the greatest one-liner in corporate history. He told Brent Scowcroft, the U.S. National Security Advisor, "We're disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." The soda company, taunting the Pentagon about disarmament because it was true. Now, before you imagine Pepsi executives in Admiral hats launching torpedoes at Coca-Cola headquarters, sadly, no. Pepsi immediately flipped the fleet to a Swedish scrap company. The mighty Pepsi Navy sailed straight into a recycling yard. The most anticlimactic military decommissioning of all time. Not a single shot fired, not even a warning splash. But the story wasn't over. In 1990, Pepsi doubled down and signed an even bigger deal with the Soviets, worth $3 billion, where the USSR would pay Pepsi by building them ships. Actual new freighters and tankers, constructed in Soviet shipyards to be sold or leased for cash. The Soviet Union had essentially become Pepsi's shipbuilding contractor, and then, in December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Poof, gone. The entire country Pepsi had spent 30 years negotiating with just dissolved. The bottling plants were suddenly scattered across 15 brand new countries. The deals were tangled in legal chaos, and worst of all for Pepsi, Coca-Cola came sprinting into the newly opened Russian market like a starving wolf, unburdened by decades of Soviet-era contracts. Pepsi had spent 30 years winning a market that vanished overnight, and their reward was watching their arch-rival eat their lunch in the ruins. So, what did we learn? A soda salesman ambushed a Soviet dictator with a free sample, parlayed it into a vodka smuggling empire, accidentally became a naval power, bragged about it to the White House, and then watched his entire customer base evaporate off the map. That's not a business strategy. That's a fever dream with quarterly earnings. The lesson? Sometimes the biggest deals in history aren't made in boardrooms. They're made in fake kitchens, sealed with vodka, and paid for in submarines. If you enjoyed watching a soft drink company briefly out-Navy actual nations, do me a favor. Smash that subscribe button for Sticky Storm, because history is packed with stories this stupid, and we are legally obligated to tell you all of them. Drop a comment with the dumbest trade deal you've ever made, and I'll see you in the next one.